Hi, Richard Marker here at the Wise Philanthropy Channel, a project of the Institute for Wise Philanthropy. It's a pleasure to be with you once again and for us to be continuing our discussion about best practices in philanthropy, particularly how we implement and integrate commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to start this discussion with looking at what can be called corporate culture, the underlying culture of how we do our business. And in that, I'm going to divide it into two categories. The affective culture, what does it look like where we work? What message comes across on our website? How do we communicate in nonverbal ways to those who might want funds or the communities within which we work? The second part has to do with some of the interpersonal kinds of relationships, but I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. Some years ago, I was a guest for a meeting at a very prominent foundation, a well-known foundation that almost everybody would have heard of in a city that I'm not going to name, and the foundation is not going to be named. The meeting took place at their headquarters. The headquarters was an extraordinarily gilded and marble-built mansion. When I went into it, I just assumed that the funder had purchased a vacant mansion, repurposed it for the purpose of the foundation. What I discovered, much to my surprise, was that wasn't what it was. In fact, the building was built from scratch, and it was built to demonstrate a concept of, I guess, a commitment to make a statement of what this foundation was about. If you went into it, there was no question of, it was over the top in terms of the kind of marble that it used, the finishings that it used. There was no question that this was the project of a very wealthy person, and the foundation was a very wealthy foundation, and you would never lose sight of it from the second you walked into the door. But what was very striking to me, and this is where I want to talk about the affect, was that the foundation staff was very proud of the fact that they would make their rooms available, their conference rooms available for the nonprofit sector. Now, that was very well-meaning, and I'm not begrudging it. I think it's a wonderful kind of contribution to the sector. But I said to myself, if I were a nonprofit leader, a staff person, coming into those facilities, I might appreciate the fact that there was a free room available to me, but I would never lose sight of the fact that there was an economic and class distinction between the one who was being beneficent and making that space available and the way I worked, and the way in which my people worked, and the way and what I needed from this foundation. It was not intended to be a statement of classism or of economic inequity, but in fact, all one had to do was walk into that building and realize that the message was very clear. If you come in here, we're the ones with the money. We're the ones with the power. We're the ones who are going to control what happens, even when we deign to give you space. It was very well-meaning, but the message could not have been lost on people. Now, lest you think that I'm holier than thou, I want to be honest. I worked in a less ostentatious place, but no less intimidating place when I was the head of a foundation. And here I will not mention it because it's relevant, and it's a building many of you know. I was the last CEO of the Seagram Corporate Foundation, known as the Bronfman Foundation. That company closed in 2002, and the foundation that I headed closed at the same time. The Seagram building, as many people know, is a world-famous landmark building on Park Avenue in New York City. My office was on the corporate suite with the top executives of the company. If you came to see me, you went through security long before there was 2001 type of security. There were security people sitting in the front. There was no question that this was an intimidating place to come to meet with somebody who was heading a foundation. It didn't matter whether I tried my best to make it a comfortable place, to where I sat in the office, so that it didn't look as if I was looking down on somebody or across at somebody. The fact was that one could not hide that I was in these corporate headquarters, and once went through the locked doors to be ushered to my office, my mini suite. I assure you that the message was not lost. The longer I have been teaching and advising since then, the more I realize how true that intimidation was, no matter what I intended. So the first thing I want to say is we have to be aware, conscious of that divide, that affective divide. I'm not arguing that all of us should move into the neighborhoods where our grantees live. First of all, that's not always so easy, and we often are granting all over the country, all over the world. So even that kind of intention won't necessarily work. It does mean that if we're serious about including people in decision making, if we're serious about respecting that we want people to be honest with us as true partners in accomplishing what our shared goals are, we have to work extra hard to make those safe spaces, given the affective divide that's so true of the way so many of us work. So that's the affective part of things. The other part has to do with the interpersonal. And this is something that we're going to come back to in subsequent posts as well. If it turns out that we're funders and we're funding organizations that are underpaying their staff, that are not giving them a living wage, that are not providing health care, that are not giving vacations, that are not giving parental leave, and yet we are funding them because they happen to be working in areas that reflect our commitment to diversity, we are not truly being equitable. We're not really committed to equity in the way in which we're doing funding, because all we're doing, even if we're giving money to those organizations, is reinforcing a deeply inequitable work environment. And so if we're serious about the DEI issue, we have to look deeper than simply the metrics of how many of what the data is between who works there and who's on what board and who's in our decision-making room. And we have to look more deeply into what we are how the organizations we are funding are building equity into their own DNA. The only people who are going to be able to effect that change are the funders, because we control what questions will be answered, and we control what is going to be possible. If all we ask of a grantee is that they give us a balanced budget, the very strong likelihood is that that balanced budget is going to be on the backs of the employees, no matter what their racial or gender or ethnic or national origin background may be. But if we start our discussion with our potential grantees with saying, what are your personnel practices? What are you doing to bring dignity to your staff? How do you guarantee that they're properly trained? How do you guarantee that they're getting a living wage? That may surprise those nonprofits at first, but it means they're going to be addressing those questions in a more serious way, knowing that we care about it and knowing that we want our funds to go to make those organizations to be truly equitable and inclusive in the way they do their business. We're going to talk more about some of the ways in which organizations can implement these kinds of things in later posts, but it's very important for us as funders, and this is addressed primarily to funders and those who participate in the funding world, to recognize that it's not simply a matter of espousing a commitment to DEI and measuring how many people come to meetings and how many people are working and how many people are on boards, but it's a matter of, are we addressing the underlying culture that defines us, that defines our grantees, and finding ways in which we can move closer toward a larger system where together we're addressing cultural underpinnings that define what we want to accomplish, how we want to accomplish it, and the ways in which we're going to get there. Thanks very much. I look forward to your comments and responses, and I look forward to sharing more thoughts on DEI and organizational culture in subsequent presentations.